Welcome back. This is Week 1, Lecture 2, History, Historiography, and the Problem of Western Civilization. Now, this lecture builds on and elaborates on the first lecture for this week. And I will go into a bit more detail on history and on what is Western, even though I've already addressed that, both in the lecture, the videoed lecture, and in the written lecture, because I think it's important. When we're looking at this course, history of Western civilization, we need to really ask, what is it? What is it that is history and civilization? And then what makes civilization Western? That helps provide the context for approaching, let's say, the material that we'll be starting next week with the emergence of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. So it's not simply the facts. It's not simply what happened and how do we know it. It is coming to an understanding of what it is that we're actually learning, what it is that I am trying to get across to you, and on what is that based. The same with the textbook. So I hope all of these kinds of questions will become clearer in any case, in some ways more less clear in any case in some ways. Because it's so complex. History is such a complex discipline. We think of it as, quote unquote, easy, even if boring and tedious, because we just go back and find facts, we find out what happened, and we go from there. But that's not the case whatsoever. So that being said, and I hope you'll see what I mean by saying those things by the end of the course, if not by the end of this lecture, when we're dealing with what is history and historiography and the problem of Western civilization. So we're going to begin right off the bat with the term history and what is history, which again I addressed a bit in the first lecture, referencing it as I believe as memory and social memory. But here I want to go into it a bit more in depth with the problem of what is history. How do we find history? What are the different definitions of history? Now, I think I mentioned either in the written lectures that I have been working on a book on what is history, as well as other different book projects. It's a long story, and I hope to get that completed at some point in the future. But I've put together 6 different definitions of history, and the PowerPoint slide there kind of gives them in brief. I just want to go over that to see that history is not a term that means one specific thing. It can mean different things. So we have up here definitions of history, and the first one is the past, everything that has ever happened. And in this sense, history is the history of the universe in many ways, because it's happened, so to speak. How did we get to where we are today? What has been the past developments that has led to this? And we can trace all of that back to the very beginning, whatever that very beginning was, however we want to interpret it and consider it to have been, whether it's quote unquote creation or the Big Bang. There is a starting point, and everything that's happened since that starting point is history in one sense. History is simply the past. Now, out of all of that massive amount of the past, we have then the recorded past. The historical period would be the difference between prehistory and history, or prehistorical and historical period, is when we have documents. We have artifacts earlier than the historical period. We have prehistoric artifacts, fossils, bones, etc., whatever, ruins of things. But only when we start to have texts, written texts, do we talk about the beginning of the historical period. And that is what demarcates prehistorical from the historical. So in that sense, history, in the sense of definition 2, is the recorded past in some fashion. Now the problem there is that so much of that has been lost. So much of the recorded past has been lost. And just as one example, I think you may have heard about the library at Alexandria. If you haven't, that's fine. But there was, according to the sources that do exist, that we do have, there was this extensive and fantastic library in Alexandria with a lot of ancient texts, writings from Greek philosophers, other individuals, and records and stories and everything else. And that library was completely destroyed. All those texts are lost. We have no idea. There's so much that has been lost. So that second definition is everything that theoretically had been written at one point in time. That brings me then to definition 3, which is the recorded past, or the historical record. We have the recorded past, theoretically, what could have been, that demarcation between prehistorical and historical. And then we have the historical record as definition number 3, which is that which still exists. Because so much that used to exist didn't. And you can say, yes, but that's Alexandria. Here's another example. For a number of years, I was at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, working on a project editing this chronicle, a world historical chronicle of a late 12th, early 13th century Cistercian Hellenoniform mall. It was extant in 2 manuscripts, one in London and one in Rome in the Vatican. But neither of those were complete. They're both partial. And the London manuscript contained books 1 through 18 of the Chronicle, and the Vatican manuscript contained books 1 through 16. There were 48 books in total. So books 18 to 48 were completely lost. There's no manuscript that exists that we knew of that contained those things. Books 45 through 48 were available in an early modern edition done in the 18th century, early 18th century. But we don't have the manuscript basis for it. We know there had been a complete manuscript of the entire Chronicon that was extant still in the later 19th century, because we have scholars who mentioned it and wrote about it. That manuscript has disappeared. So even with the early modern edition of books 45 through 48, books 19 through 44 are completely gone. No one really talked about what was in there. And that was in terms of the coverage that Helenon gave to that period. That was the period of, from the later Roman Empire through about the 12th century, or the 10th century in any case. So it is a huge part of how Helenon conceived of history that is gone. So much is missing. So the issue is that historians can only write based on the extant sources. And so if they disappear, we can't make them up. We can't fabricate what had happened. So that is the problem that we face. Now, when we look to then historical history definition 4, historical scholarship, that too is a problem, because historical scholarship, or what professional historians write based on the historical record of that which is extant, is also not everything. Historians go to the past. We don't go to the past. We'll get to that in a second. But we analyze documents and evidence. And I'll be saying more about this. We analyze documents and evidence, but we don't analyze everything that still exists. From my own work on the late medieval Augustinians, there are manuscripts out there that basically have never been looked at. And we can say, well, why? There are legitimate reasons, but we'll get there a little bit, not explicitly, but in the general sense. Because no one has ever been led to look at them or to look for them. But there are excellent manuscripts out there that really have never been studied. That is for a medieval or late medieval view, but that also goes all the way into modern times. In 89 or 1990, in the summer, I forget which it was, I was a member of a small group of American graduate students through the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. Did a paleography course in Wolfenbüttel in Germany, and we also then toured archives. And one of the archives we went to was in Potsdam. Now, Potsdam is outside of Berlin. It's like a suburb, so to speak, of Berlin. And it had been in what was known as East Germany. And this was right shortly after the fall of the wall. Or let's say as the wall was falling. That I don't know. I know this shows my age because for me that was a somewhat recent event. And I still remember seeing on television pictures as it was happening with people tearing down the wall, at least in part because it wasn't completely destroyed for a little while. It took a little demolition. It was not an ephemeral wall. But it was in the Eastern Bloc in the Eastern Germany, which is part of the Soviet sphere of influence. And we were the first American group, first Western group to be allowed into this archive, the small archive. Potsdam's not a big city. It's a smallish archive. Now, there's a difference between libraries and archives. In general, libraries contain books. Archives contain documents. Now, that's not a huge issue, but let's say if there are tax records, if there are receipts, if there are treaties or charters, those are often in archives. Whereas texts, treatises, collected letters, sometimes diaries, those types of things are in libraries. That distinction is a big one in terms of this course. It is a very important one if you're doing historical research. And it's also going to be frustrating because there are books in archives and there are documents in libraries, but in general, that's the distinction. But anyway, we went to this archive, and it was not a huge archive. It was a relatively small-ish archive, which is a building holding documents. Documents in archives are stored in boxes, archival boxes. You can still go to Staples and buy archival boxes to put documents in. So what the archivist would do and did, they would take a box and they'd put documents in there, and then they would mark on it what it was contained, more or less. And then you put them on shelves. And documents in archives are measured by meters. How many meters of those boxes on the shelves can you read? And an historian, in his or her lifetime, can not get through all that many meters of boxes. Depending, of course, how many, because it's also very frustrating because you just see, a box that says, let's say, letters from, German letters 1312 to 1602, right? This would be on the outside of the box. I thought, oh, this could be perfect. You open it up, and there's one letter from 1312, and there's one letter from 1602, so only two documents. But they could be also full, so it all depends on what's there. Now, the point of all this is that in this archive in Potsdam, the archivist took us down into what's called the magazine, where all the documents are stored in meters and shelves, or in meters of shelves, put it all there. And he took us into this one room. It was not a large room, but it was not like a closet. It was a small room. Kind of like the small rooms, some of the small lecture rooms at IUPUI in Cavanaugh Hall, if any of you have been in one of those. Not one of the big lecture halls, but a smaller room. So, it was like filled with shelves and documents. So you have, top to bottom shelf, all filled with boxes of documents all the way through. And he said, these are all documents from the Nazi period. They had never been touched. They'd never been looked at. I was like, whoa. Because the Nazi period in Germany, from let's say 1925 to 1945, has been one of the most researched areas of all of history. Combed through not only just by Americans, but by German scholars, by European scholars, because this is a huge deal, right? And here was an entire room of documents that had never been looked at. The question is, why? Most likely, simply, no one had ever gotten to it yet. And one historian could not read that many meters. One historian could not have read all the documents in that room. One historian could not have read half of the documents in that room. One of the historian could not probably have read a fourth of the documents in that room in their entire career. That's what we're talking about. Now, most of those documents probably are not very significant. Let's talk about receipts. There may be, a document there, whatever it would be, and and Der Fuhrer has approved the purchase of another, 200,000 shoestrings for the soldiers. Oh, there we go. Things like that. But the point is, until we look at them, we don't know what's in there. So the issue of definition 4 now, what historians write based on the historical record, is a subset of the historical record. So we have everything from the past, everything, to what could have been looked at, because it's the recorded, the historical period. And then we have the extant historical documents. And then we have what historians write. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Then we have number 5, definition number 5, the historical profession. And what does that mean? Well, it means that there is a professional discipline of history as an academic subject. So often we refer to history as the discipline of history. We have a history department. This is a history course. How is it all organized? How is it determined what history courses are taught? How do we go about doing so? That's all part of the discipline of history of professional historians. I can say a lot more about that, but that's okay. But this is history number 5. And history number 5 then seeps into history 6, which is the general impression of history out there in the public, the general public. What does the general public think of history? Whether it is an informed opinion or an uninformed opinion. In history courses, many of you, this could be one of the few, if not the only history course you ever take. You had history in elementary school, I'm assuming, and in high school, but still you have not received a thorough education in history. It's been selected because textbooks, especially in education, on the elementary and even in high school, the textbooks are way behind what historians write. So we have that history 4 sifted through history 5, that then is dispersed in history 6. And if, for those people out there who have not gone to college or who go to college but do not take a history course, they're left with an elementary or even high school understanding, which is, even at the time, not up to the standard of what the historians are saying. And then in the general public, that concept of history starts fusing with all kinds of other issues and problems, concerns. And people start using the past, just like with memory, selectively to support their sense of who we are. If we say in the general sense, history is memory or social memory, that gets then also to identity. So there's an issue with the definition of history. So when we're talking about history, what are we really talking about? Well, I'm not going to elaborate more on all of these as well, and the problems involved in each one of them. It gets back to the question of then how do we really know what happened? And that is a real problem. That is a real problem. How do we know what happened? And that brings us back to theories and philosophies of history. I'm not going to go into a great deal of extent because there's a whole field of philosophy, or a subdiscipline of philosophy, known as the philosophy of history. And it gets even complex because we have the philosophy of history. We also have the philosophy of historiography. That is a complex distinction, and I'm not going to say much more about that. I will address that in my book, so if that ever comes out, you can read that and see some of the distinctions. But the point here is philosophers ask the question, what is the past? How do we know it? It's a philosophical question. How do we go about doing it? The problem is most philosophers of history are not really historians or trained philosophers. Most historians are not trained in the philosophy of history, and most historians don't really care about the philosophy of history. There is a distinction between the philosophy of history and theories of history. Now, historians do a lot of theorizing about history. different historical schools of interpretation or theories. Marxism, I'm not talking about Karl Marx itself, but all the impact of a Marxist perspective is a theory of the past. In some ways, that's what Marxism is in Marx's views, is a theory of the development of human civilizations and the conflict between capital and labor for Marx. But that's not the point of this course. That's not the point here. But the point here is that's a way of understanding developments. What makes the past change? What makes for historical change? How do we understand the march of time? And historians deal with that with theories, and then philosophers do it more with that with philosophies, even though it's a fine distinction between the disciplines of philosophy and history. But the problem is there's often a disconnect between the two. And that is a problem for everybody. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in my book, is trying to bring those together to harmonize them in a greater whole. It's difficult to have a philosophy of history when you really are not a practitioner of history, don't really understand what doing history is. And if you don't have a sophisticated understanding of the philosophy of history, how can you actually do history? So that's kind of what my project is that I'm still struggling with and working on. Again, the distinction between the theories of history and philosophies of history is not the point here, but it's just to say that the question is that both deal with, and historians do, there has to be either implicitly or explicitly a theory of how it all works. The idea that we just read a source, we read it, we understand it, there we know what happened, we know what somebody thought. Your term paper is based on Plato's Republic, right? Now, you read Plato, so you read the Republic. Do you know what Plato thought? Oh, yeah, well, I can read what's here. Yeah, no. But you know what? You're not reading Plato's text. You're reading a translation, an English translation. There are always problems with translations, even if it's a good translation. Is there an extant copy of what Plato actually wrote? No. There are copies of what he actually wrote. So we don't even have the original text of Plato's Republic. It was put together later. So we're not reading Plato in Greek, in ancient Greek. You're reading a translation. And that translation is based on an edition, a critical edition, which is based on the manuscript evidence that witnesses or signifies what Plato wrote. That's how distant it is. So how do we know really then what he wrote and what he meant by it? We can't ask him. It is an attempt to reconstruct or try to reconstruct what he may have meant. As scholars, Plato scholars argue a lot about the Republic, and that's not even part of your term paper. What was it meaning? Have you ever misread something? Anything in general. If you've read something and said, no, that's what or even misheard, or if you're talking with somebody and say, oh, yeah, well, you said this. Yeah, but that's not what I was meaning. Oh, okay, well, I guess I misheard, misunderstood. That is what historical debate is all about. What do these texts mean? Because texts don't have any meaning. They don't sit and say, oh, this is what I mean. This is, historians or scholars have to interpret those texts and try to find a meaning. And that's what we argue about. We argue about what was Plato really getting at here. And that's just one text that we have a lot of evidence for. How you go about doing that is the issues of different interpretations, different schools of thought, different approaches. What is it all based on? How does language work? Which are all philosophical questions. Again, that is not part of the course itself, but is important for coming to this understanding that history, whether it's what is taught in schools, in elementary and high schools, whether it's what is taught in universities, whether it's what I'm teaching you here, or in beginning, let's say, next week in terms of the structures of the course or the content of the course and what the textbook is saying, is not a given. It is an interpretation of a very difficult process. And so often we accept what we have been taught or what we think about the past as the past. And that is the problem. Because the past does not exist. And there we get to the rub of the problem of history and what history is. The non-existent past. The past does not exist. You can say, okay, that's kind of stupid. Fine, you say it's stupid. Show me the past. You can't. You cannot show me the past. If I say, what did you do yesterday? You go, oh, I did this and this. I said, well, prove it. Well, I don't need to prove. Do you have documents for it? No. I remember it. What's your memory? Memories are selective. Now, I can remember what I did yesterday, sort of, basically. Do I remember everything I did? No. Do I have documents for what I did yesterday? Some, actually, but not very many. And that's just for yesterday. And if I remember yesterday today, am I remembering what it was like yesterday, or am I remembering my memory in the present? You can't show me the past. The past is not like it's not a piece of evidence from the past. You say, well, we have fossils. We have the texts that you were talking about in libraries and archives. Yes, we do. So go read a text from the library. You're doing so in the present because this exists. If I said go read Helenon's Chronicle, book 25, you couldn't do it because it doesn't exist. So all our looking at, examining evidence takes place in the present. And I think it gets into the whole problem of time and what is time. I'm not going to go into all of that here, but it's a huge problem for history because what is time? The future doesn't exist. The past doesn't exist. All that exists is the present, but the present is very, very ephemeral. Because already, what I said at the beginning of this lecture is past. You remember it. You can stop right here and go back and read it again, but you're doing so in the present. You're not going back and doing that in the past as you did the first time. It's a problem. The past does not exist. What exists are artifacts, and here I include texts and the written. For me, artifact is anything that exists. An artifact, something that humans have made, or other pieces of evidence, ruins, etc., that signify that which no longer exists, but did exist. You can say that the past did exist, but it does not exist now. And how do we know what did exist? Based on the evidence, which is always read, interpreted, analyzed in the present. That's why history is not a thing of the past, it's a thing of the present. We look at the extant evidence that signifies what had happened, what had been, but we can't go back and look. We don't have a time machine. Even if we did, there's all kinds of problems because of different perspectives and views. If I could take all of us back in a time machine, we'd all have different views because we experience things different. If I said right now, take out pen and paper or whatever, get on your computer, write an essay on what is going on in the world right now, there's going to be a lot of commonality, but there's going to be also different perspectives on it. What do we focus on? What do we bring about? How do we put it all together? That's the problem of the historian. If we could go back in the time machine, we'd have the same problem. But we can't. We can't observe the past. We can only observe the extant evidence that signifies that which no longer exists. And that is part of the problems and complexities of history, just on that level. I can go into more complexities of history. That's not part of right here, but it is. It's related because to what do we really need to know? We don't. We're interested in the facts, so to speak. We're more interested in why did this happen? How was this possible? We're talking about human behavior. We're talking about human individuals, human minds, human thoughts and feelings. It's difficult to explain humans and human behavior. It's like, okay, well, why am I lecturing right now? That's something that I'm doing. That's a human act. I'm doing that right now because I'm teaching this course. Okay, but why am I doing it right now? Because I think I had the opportunity to do so. So I thought I'd get it out of the way, so to speak. I mean, I love this lecture, but still, to get it out of the way, because it's not like a scheduled class time. Not get it out of the way, but tick the box that that one's done. We can go from there. Why am I doing that? Because I'm a member of the faculty at the Department of History. And now it's IU Indy. Why am I that? Because a long time ago now, I applied for a position here, and I was granted the position. I got the job. Why did I get the job? Because the people who made that decision decided that I would be the best candidate. Why did they do that? I don't know. Why did I even apply? Because I had gone to graduate school, I got my PhD, and I was looking for a job. My job in Groningen, as I said, was over. And I was at the University of Tennessee for a couple of years, but that was not a permanent position. So I was looking for a permanent job, and I applied. Why? We can keep going. Why? How does it all work? What does it all mean? And what does it mean to me? And what this course means to me is a lot different from what this course means to you. Is there some absolute standard of what this all means? But isn't that what we're trying to get at with the past? Isn't that what we tried to come up with? Isn't that what we argue about? Oh, this means that. No, it doesn't. It means this. How do we handle that problem? That's what historical scholarship is all about. And if we have to base it on the extant evidence, because if we don't, we're simply talking about different opinions and views and tastes. This probably is getting a bit tangential here, but that's okay. It'd be like arguing over what's the best flavor of ice cream. I mean, I know for myself, I know it's, Haagen-Dazs vanilla bean ice cream. No one else, no other thing comes close. And then my wife is like, no, it's Haagen-Dazs coffee ice cream. Someone else might say, no, it's Ben and Jerry's Chunky Monkey. It's like, oh. Is there any way to prove what's the best? See, absolutely not. Different opinion and taste. Because for me, it's true. If I say that the best ice cream in the world is Haagen-Dazs vanilla bean, for me, that's a true statement. But if I don't say, to me, the best ice cream in the world is Haagen-Dazs, then I have to defend my position with an argument. There's no way to defend that. There's no evidence or proof that makes it that way, because it's a matter of taste and opinion. With history, we can't just make things up. We have to base it on the documents that can be analyzed. That is the challenge and the excitement. I believe, at least for the written lecture, for the first written lecture, I talk about the difference between history as science and history as art. And history is both, in my view. Science and art. And the science is the analysis of the extant evidence, the actual things, the actual artifacts that exist that we need to examine and analyze scientifically. But that doesn't tell us the meaning. Then we have to bring the art to it of actually interpreting and writing about it. And that then brings us to historiography. Because in the writing of it, the sources, knowing that which does not exist, okay, we create the past as we write about it. That is what this is all about. Based on the sources, or the sources, or the artifacts, we have to come up with some explication, some sense of what happened in the past that does not exist. And it's that sense that we create the past as we write about it. And that then brings me from history to historiography. So now I'm on the slide, historiography. In a very basic definition, historiography is the history of history. It is what historians write. If I were to give it a course on the historiography of the history of Western civilization, it would be different than the course that I'm giving, which is the history of Western civilization. What I would do in that course on the historiography, we're looking at how it developed and what the course itself, not the content, but the course, and how scholars have written about Western civilization in the past. Scholars change. Historiography develops and changes over time as we learn more, as we discover more, as interests change. Just for one example, women's history 100 years ago, I'm not going to say it didn't exist, but it was not really part of history. And you may say, well, looking at your course, it's still not part of history. You have a valid point there, but that's another issue. If you have questions about that, send me an email. I can talk about it. But since the 1960s, anyway, women's history has gotten to be a big subdiscipline of history. And I think that's, in some ways, it's a positive, but we need to go beyond that because it's not a subdiscipline of history. Women are part of history and have been all along from the very beginning. So we shouldn't say there's history and then there's women's history. That is, I think, a denigration of the role of women in the world as it's always has been. Anyway, but just as this is just getting at the point, it has been like a new development. New questions have been asked. Economic history is relatively new. It used to be that history was primarily politics and military history. Social history, as such, is new. What did people eat? What did they wear? What did they do in their free time? Those kinds of questions are new questions that only really developed since the 1960s. There's a long story to all this, but looking at how the questions that we ask about the sources that are extant, that signify that which never existed, those questions change as our understanding and our interests change. So historiography is looking at those changing questions that are asked about the sources as it goes along. Just for an example, right now, the Middle Ages, I study, even early modern Europe to an extent, are not part of the trend. There are very, very, very few jobs in history to be professors of history overall. But of those jobs, there are very, 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 very few for medieval historians or even early modern historians. Trendy positions, Russia, China. Russia's been trendy for a while, but China especially. Digital history. There are different trends. And that is what then, going back to History 5, the fifth definition of history as a discipline, is politically determined. And that is what they're focusing on, and that's what they're going to be hiring. I can go off on this a lot because there's a positive, natural, understandable dynamic or aspect of this dynamic, and then there's a more cynical view of it, which I hold kind of both at the same time. But the whole point is that history changes as what historians write changes. And what historians write changes based on changing interests and needs by whomever of the society at the time as they're writing in the present. So the history today is very different than it was 100 years ago, even though there are some things that are very similar. There's a lot of change. And that's what historiography is, the history of history and how it all changes. We have a changing past? Yes, we do. Because why is part of those changes that then affect how history is taught that eventually trickle down to high school and elementary textbooks, which aren't written by historians. High school, some sort of, but they're written by people who put them together, school curricula. As you know, I would hope and think, or think and hope, is not determined by historians. It's determined by boards of education, which are made up of parents, people in the communities who do not have history training. They just have whatever they were taught in school themselves, and so it becomes a political issue. And it's based on a lack of knowledge and understanding and not what is the most recent cutting edge understanding and knowledge of professional historians. So that gets to be a problem. And that then, History 6 in that sense shapes History 5, which shapes History 4, even as History 4 shapes History 5, not so much History 6. So when we talk about history, it's that whole complex development and the interactions between those different definitions of history that affect how we go about and what we think about, quote unquote, the past. Historiography looks at the history of the changing past, how the questions that we ask have changed. Was there, for example, a history of LGBTQ people or movements or whatever you want to, rights 100 years ago? Absolutely not. Gay history of homosexuality has been around for a little while, for, again, since the 60s or 70s, 80s. But then it all changes. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? That's what I'm getting at. You can't go back and say, okay, I want to find out what was the historical understanding of LGBTQ in 1910. You can't do it because even the term didn't exist. That's what we're getting at when we're talking about the changing past and how it changes based on what historians write and our understanding of it. But asking questions, we're always asking questions because we always want to know and try to understand how did we get here. What influences led to us getting here, and why is the world the way it is? And because time, which is a complete mystery, but time is always changing, even though we're always in the present. But you know what? When we get down to it, the present doesn't exist either. When you say, what do you mean the present? Well, as I said earlier on, the beginning of this lecture is in the past. When I was talking earlier about the definitions of history for the first time, that's already in the past. What I just said is already in the past. We can keep dividing the past from the present and the future until the present is no longer there. This is probably even Augustine, the person I study, one of the people I study, recognized and said, the past, as soon as I utter a syllable, a sound. So if I pronounce a word, the first sound is gone by the time I'm finished with saying the word. It's already become past. He says there is no present. It's simply the passing of the future into the past. So if there's no past, and obviously the future does not yet exist, and the present does not exist, the past did exist, what is time and what is history? And how we deal with it? We assume so much. But that's not the case. So, yeah, okay. I see now why, beginning to see why philosophy of history may be important. Maybe. Because what does that have to do with Western civilization? So it has everything to do with Western civilization in this course. Because you're reading a textbook. You're reading it in the present. It's like the 12th edition or something like that, so it's been revised, or it's more likely just reprinted so they can all make more money on it. It's written from a given perspective based on the sources. It has tried to update historiographical issues. I'm giving my lectures, same thing. I've been teaching this course since, I guess 2002 was the first time I taught Western civilization. I was a TA for it as a graduate student. I've been dealing with this course for a long time. My perspectives on it change. Every time I teach it, there are things that are different. And it is all part of this ongoing process of coming to an understanding. It's not a fixed thing. We're not saying, okay, what is this thing? It's not like analyzing a rock. Analyzing the sources, the artifacts, are very similar to analyzing a rock. But looking at history is far more than that. Now, it affects how we understand what did happen, because I'm not sitting here saying that the past does not exist and therefore did not exist and therefore this is all whatever made up. It's not. I believe, me personally, I believe in the quote-unquote objective historical past, that yesterday did exist. Now, what is not objective is our understandings and experiences of it. The same for, 4000 BCE. That's what we're trying to get at. And this course kind of starts in terms of the emergence of civilization, as we'll talk about in the first lecture of next week. How do we come to an understanding of it? How do we come to an understanding of that which has made us who we are? That's what we're getting at. And it is so complex and so difficult. I'm saying that not to try to scare you off or chase you away. If you think about it too much, or at least if I think about it too much, I just kind of get freaked out. It's like I can never say another thing. I can never write another word about, in terms of my own research. And how do I know? We have to do the best we can do. It's an impossible task. We can never say what Plato thought. We can only come to an interpretation and try to come to an understanding of what Plato thought based on our analysis of the extant evidence. In the present, it doesn't exist. Now, this is important in my view, because when you are learning about the history of Western civilization, what is it that we're doing? That's why I've tried to focus this course, the first lectures of the first week, on some of these problems. Now, that's what historiography is about. And one of the issues of historiography has been the whole concept of Western civilization. Western civilization as a course, which only arose in the 19th century or so when German and American scholars said, you know what, we need to teach the history of ourselves. We privileged white males. We're going to teach the history of the triumph of Western civilization, how great we are. And here I am, a privileged white male, teaching about Western civilization. And I think I said last time, in the last lecture, that a lot of universities and so have gotten rid of Western civilization courses for world history. If you see there up on this slide for Western civilization, culture, civilization, and world history, which is not actually where I am. I'm still with ideology and identity, which I haven't really completed to, but still it's there. For world history. But if Western civilization is so complex and problematic, so world history is even more so. It gets to be the point where we can't do it, and all what we're doing is reducing to a manageable level to spew out information. I've stressed this issue of memory, and I think I talked about it before. Memory is identity, and I've even implicitly talked about it during this lecture. Who we are and how we got here. Who are we? Answer that question. I'm assuming a lot older than most of you. Maybe somebody registered in the course that's around my age, perhaps even older. But I'm assuming here, which assumings are always a problem. But I can, go through the roster and I can find out more or less your ages in a general sense. Your birthdays are not given, don't worry, but I can still see, where you're registered and what you are, blah, 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 blah. The point is I'm a lot older than you are. I've, lived through a lot more. And, I was born in 1962. Okay. I still don't know who I am. When I was in high school, I was really damn sure I knew who I was. That has then increasingly become problematic and fallen away. And now it's like, I'm not sure who I am. I can tell you things about me. I'm a professor of history, full professor of history at what is now IU Indianapolis. I've published 5 books. I'm working on about to publish another one, and we'll hopefully finish another one before too long. And then have another one. So I'm a scholar of late medieval Reformation Europe. I'm married and I have 2 sons, and blah 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 blah. I can tell you those things about me, those quote unquote facts. That doesn't answer the question, who am I? You could ask, I could ask you, who am I? You've seen my lectures thus far. You've had some experience with me. You could, if your friend of yours says, well, who is Professor Sack? You would have some kind of a answer to give. Is that really who I am? Am I whom you think I am? Am I who I think I am? That question is so difficult. And it's difficult not only for individuals, it's difficult for groups because of that social memory. Memory is related to identity. That social memory, that social identity of who we are. Whether it's a family, whether it's a city, whether it's a state, whether it's a nation. Who are we? What does it mean to be an American? Well, there's different understandings. There's different definitions. Yeah, but we all are living here in this geographical territory that is signified by the term United States of America. But what does that mean? That's what we're all getting at. And the same for every nation and state and country and group. What does it mean? And self-definition is different from being defined from outside. We'll see that as we go through this course. Answering that question is problematic, but that issue of identity is part of ideology. I think I addressed ideology in the last lecture. It's the structures that allow us to make sense of reality. Because in some ways, if I didn't have some sense of who I am, I would not be able to be giving this lecture. I'd be sitting here going, what? I don't know what to do. I don't know who I am. I'm almost to that point with me, but that's a whole other question. But the point being is that our identity is our basis for who we are and what we do and how we act, our actions, our functions. How do we understand of ourselves and conceive of ourselves, whether it's quote unquote true or not? Is my perception of myself more true than your perception of me? Now we can talk a lot about that. But what allows me to function and make sense of myself and my world, I'd say the same thing for you guys, for every one of you, I refer to as ideology, as the structures that allow us to make sense of reality. That's all it is. That has been the case from the beginning of human culture, their culture, civilization, and world history. We have to remember and make the distinction between culture and civilization. I addressed this a bit first lecture. Human cultures before there's human civilization. Civilization is a particular type of culture. And then Western civilization is a particular type of civilization. So how do we break this all down? And what makes for Western civilization? What makes for that particular form of civilization, which was a particular form of human culture that we designate as Western civilization? I'm going to be looking at, through this course, which I hope you'll become familiar with, let's say, the myth of the West. In one way, the myth of the West is what makes Western civilization Western. You have to be dealing with that question, answering that question in the final. And part of that myth of the West is the theme of justice and the question of what is justice and how do we have a just society? How do we have a just state? There are other, let's say, windows or perspectives or concepts that I could use to talk about the myth of the West, which in general is huge. But as I've framed it before in the past on final exams, the myth of Western civilization is Western civilization, or Western civilization is the myth of Western civilization. It's there. That's kind of the gist of what I'm getting at. We're talking about the myth of the West. It's the myth of Western civilization. But that myth is based on the question of justice. That's why I'm assigning Plato, because I think that's so important when we really look at it. From Plato on, even before Plato, we can go back to Hammurabi. I'll be talking about Hammurabi next week. There was this sense of, if we were going to live together, how do we do so? And how do we do so that is just and right and good? But how are those terms defined? What makes for justice? What makes for a just society? In some ways, that has been a distinctively Western question. And that's what we're going to be looking at. That's going to be our lens through which we try to look at the development of this thing of Western civilization, whatever that might be, as it has developed, and the impact of that not a thing, it's an idea, it's a concept, it's an ideology, the ideology of the West. How has that impacted civilization and world history? Because it has. But to understand that, we have to focus, kind of extract it out of the natural context, so to speak, in the laboratory and look at it. That's what this course is trying to do. It's not saying that Western civilization is the pinnacle of all of civilization on the globe, and isn't this a great thing, a task as it's spread throughout the world. No, it's trying to say, okay, we're going to take this out and look at it and examine it to find out what impact it had and how it came to have the impact that it did, and how did it affect the rest of the world. Now, that's only partly what we'll get to, because the focus in this part of the course, at least in my part of the course, is on that kind of extraction. And towards the end of the course, we'll be looking at the expansion and how it impacted the rest of the world, because it did, which is not an issue of European triumphalism or Western triumphalism or Eurocentrism. It's just looking at the quote-unquote facts of the impact of Europeans on the world, which is not all positive in my view. Not all positive at all. But that's not the point. The point is not to then undermine and damn the Western tradition. It is to look how that has functioned within the broader context. So that kind of puts it together in perspective. This course then, as I'm teaching it, looks at the impact of the myth of the West through the lens of the question of justice and what is a just state, and how has that been answered in different ways over time. Because that's always the case. That time changes, history changes and develops, and the questions we ask differ, even if they stay the same. Or I should say, perhaps, that the answers to the questions we ask change, even if the questions stay the same, because the questions of what is justice and what is a just state has been asked in the Western tradition since the very beginnings thereof with the ancient Greeks, if not with the origins of civilization itself. But we'll see that through the course of the lectures and the course of this course, so to speak. And it all comes back to asking questions. And where do we go from here? It depends on where you want to take it. I think I've tried to lay out for you how I conceive of this course, how I've constructed this course, and tried to give some indication of why I've done it that way. Ask questions. Evaluate, ask questions. There are some things that you're going to have to fulfill the requirements. You're going to have to do the assignments. You're going to have to learn the material. But most of all, I hope you'll start questioning for yourselves, what does this all mean? Not for me that you can then repeat on an exam, because that's not what I'm even looking for on the exam. But what does this all mean to me? I mean, to you. I want you to ask that question. Who am I, and what does all of this mean to me? How does this all affect me? That's what I want you to write about, or think about, not write about. Because you have to defend your position with the course material, the evidence. You can't just make it up. This is not about what's the best ice cream. It's about how well you analyze and interpret the course material, which is the evidence, which are the lectures and the textbook. And once again, if you have any questions, ask. I'm here to try to help. And I hope by the end of this course, if not by the end of this lecture, you'll come to appreciate the complexities and difficulties of history. In my view, history is the most complex and most difficult subject you can study. Anyway, it's the most exciting too, I would say. That's why we do it. We don't do it because it's so difficult and complex. It's because it's so exciting, and I would argue so imperative for ourselves and our societies to understand who we are within this global context in which we find ourselves today. That's what it's all about. If you have any questions, please just ask, and I'll be back with the lecture for next week on the emergence of civilization, and we'll go from there. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.